I was staring at the surveyor's report when I heard the construction equipment rumbling up the mountain behind my house, and something in my gut told me this was going to be bad. My name is Ethan Harris, and I own a modest cabin on 15 acres in the mountains outside Breckenridge, Colorado. I bought the property 8 years ago, before the developers showed up and started building their luxury resort community called Alpine Vista. When I moved here, it was just me, the elk, and the occasional hiker. Then came the condos, the clubhouse, and the people. Lots and lots of wealthy people who wanted their slice of mountain paradise, but couldn't handle actual mountain living. The HOA formed about 5 years ago. At first, they left me alone since my property was technically outside their boundaries. But over the years, they kept pushing, trying to get me to join, offering to improve my land, suggesting my rustic cabin brought down their property values. I always politely declined. My property was grandfathered in, and I had every right to exist exactly as I was. The construction noise grew louder. I grabbed my coat and headed outside into the February cold. Snow was piled high everywhere, typical for this time of year. That's when I saw them. Construction crews were assembling what looked like massive steel towers on the ridge above my property. I hiked up through the snow, my boots crunching with each step, following the tree line until I got close enough to see what they were building: a ski lift. They were building a full ski lift system that would transport people from the lower resort area to the peak. And the cable line ran directly over my property, not near it, over it. The shadow of the cable would cut right across my back acres. "Hey," I shouted at the nearest worker. "What the hell is this?" The guy looked at me like I was interrupting his lunch. "Ski lift construction." "Been approved for months." "Approved by who?" "This crosses my land," he shrugged. "Don't know anything about that, buddy. I just build what I'm told to build. You got questions, take it up with Alpine Vista HOA. I stormed back to my cabin and dug out my property deed and survey maps. My land was clearly marked. The lift was absolutely crossing my airspace and my property. They had no legal right to do this. None. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA office. A chipper voice answered. "Alpine Vista HOA, this is Melissa speaking. How may I help you?" "This is Ethan Harris. I own the property on Mountain Ridge Road, and there's a ski lift being built over my land right now. I want to speak to whoever approved this." "Oh, Mr. Harris, let me transfer you to our president, Patricia." Of course her name was Patricia. Probably went by Patty or Pat. I waited on hold, listening to elevator music while my blood pressure climbed. "Mr. Harris, this is Patricia Monroe, HOA president. How can I help you?" The voice was sweet, but had that underlying steel that all HOA presidents seem to possess. "You can start by explaining why there's a ski lift being built over my property without my permission." "Oh, that. Well, Mr. Harris, we followed all proper procedures. The lift was approved by the county, and we have all the necessary permits. Did you get my permission?" "We sent a letter to all affected parties months ago." "I never received any letter, and I'm not part of your HOA. My property is private." Patricia's voice took on that condescending tone I'd come to recognize from too many encounters with entitled people. "Mr. Harris, the airspace rights were part of an easement established decades ago. We simply exercised those rights. Everything is perfectly legal." "That's a lie. I've reviewed my deed. There's no easement for a ski lift. Perhaps you should consult with a lawyer if you have concerns." "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting. The lift will be operational by the end of the month. Have a good day." She hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, shaking with anger. They thought they could just steamroll over me because they had money and influence. I immediately called a property lawyer in Denver named Robert Chen, who I'd used when I first bought the place. His secretary said he could see me the next day. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the construction equipment, even though they'd stopped work at sundown. I looked at my property in the moonlight, at the peaceful acres I'd maintained, and imagined dozens of tourists swinging overhead in gondolas, dropping trash, peering down at my home. The next morning, I drove to Denver, fighting through snow squalls on I-70. Robert's office was in a modern building downtown. He greeted me warmly, though his expression turned serious when I explained the situation. "Let me look at your deed and survey," he said, spreading the documents across his desk. He studied them for a long time, making notes. "Ethan, you're right. There's no easement here for overhead construction or transit. Do you have the county permits they mentioned?" "No, but I can get them." "Do that. If they filed for permits, they had to submit property owner notifications. If they falsified those documents, we have a case. But I need to warn you, fighting an HOA with deep pockets is expensive and time-consuming." "I don't care. This is my land." Robert nodded. "I'll start drafting a cease and desist letter. Meanwhile, get those permits." I drove to Summit County offices in Breckenridge. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Sandra, helped me pull the permit applications for the Alpine Vista ski lift. As I read through them, my anger turned white-hot. They'd listed my property as part of the HOA common area. They'd completely misrepresented ownership. The signature on the owner notification form wasn't mine. It was forged. "Can I get copies of all this?" I asked Sandra. "Absolutely. That'll be 50 cents per page." I paid for the copies and drove straight back up the mountain. The construction had progressed significantly. 2 towers were now fully erected and they were working on a third. The cable line was being strung. They were moving fast, probably trying to finish before I could stop them. I called Robert from my truck. "They forged documents. They claimed my property as HOA land and forged a signature for owner notification." "That's fraud, Ethan. That's actually criminal. I'll file an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning, and you might want to contact the sheriff's office." I drove to the Summit County Sheriff's Office and filed a report. The deputy who took my statement, a young guy named Officer Brooks, seemed sympathetic but warned me that property disputes usually had to be resolved in civil court first. "If they forged documents, though, that's another matter," he said. "We'll open an investigation. Do you have the evidence?" I handed over copies of everything. He looked through them, his expression growing more serious. "I'll pass this to our fraud investigation unit. They'll contact you within a few days." Days. They wanted me to wait days while the HOA continued construction. I drove home and found a notice stuck to my door. It was from the Alpine Vista HOA, informing me that I was in violation of community standards for having unsightly vehicles on my property. The vehicles in question were my 15-year-old pickup truck and my ATV, both perfectly functional and maintained. This was harassment, plain and simple. The next week was a blur of legal activities. Robert filed the emergency injunction. The HOA fought it with their own lawyers, 3 of them from a firm in Denver. The hearing was set for 2 weeks out because the judge's calendar was full. In the meantime, construction continued. I watched every day as the lift took shape. The towers stood like steel giants. The cables were strung and tensioned. They started installing the gondola cars, sleek modern things that would carry 8 people each, and every single one would pass directly over my property. Patricia Monroe showed up at my door one evening, accompanied by 2 other HOA board members. Patricia was exactly what I'd imagined. Mid-50s, expensive ski jacket, perfect blonde highlights, and that practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Harris," I'm Patricia Monroe. I believe we spoke on the phone. These are board members Susan Clark and David Brennan. May we come in? No. What do you want? Patricia's smile flickered. We want to resolve this situation amicably. We understand you have concerns about the lift. It crosses my property without permission. You forged documents. That's a serious accusation, David said. He was younger, maybe early 40s, with the look of a tech executive who'd made his money and retired to the mountains. We have all proper documentation. Forged documentation. I've filed a police report and a lawsuit. Patricia's smile vanished entirely. Mr. Harris, you're being unreasonable. This lift will benefit the entire community, including you. Property values will increase. We're even prepared to offer you a compensation package. I don't want your money. I want you to take down the lift. That's not going to happen, Susan said. She was the oldest of the three, probably pushing 60, with the hard look of someone used to getting her way. We've invested $2 million in this project. It's not coming down because you're being stubborn. Then you wasted $2 million. Get off my property. Patricia pulled out an envelope. This is our offer. $50,000 for the easement rights, retroactively applied. Take it or leave it. I'm leaving it. And I'm leaving you to get off my land in the next 30 seconds or I'm calling the sheriff. They left, but Patricia turned back at her car. You're making a mistake, Mr. Harris. This community takes care of its friends and deals with its enemies. Think about which you want to be. Is that a threat? It's reality. Good evening. I called Robert immediately and told him about the encounter. He advised me to document everything and avoid any confrontation that could be twisted against me. The hearing finally arrived. We gathered in the Summit County Courthouse, a modern building that always smelled faintly of coffee and stress. Judge Maria Santiago presided. She was known as fair but no nonsense. Robert presented our case methodically. He showed the forged documents, the property surveys, and my deed. The HOA's lawyers, led by a sharp-dressed man named Gregory Walsh, argued that the easement was implied by historical use and that I was holding up community development for personal gain. Your Honor, Gregory said smoothly, Mr. Harris is attempting to extort the Alpine Vista community. He's had weeks to raise these concerns and chose to wait until construction was nearly complete. He's now demanding the lift be torn down, costing our community millions. That's absurd, Robert countered. Mr. Harris filed complaints the day he discovered the construction. He was never notified because the HOA falsified documents. The judge reviewed everything carefully. Finally, she spoke. I'm issuing a temporary restraining order on any further construction pending a full hearing on the property rights question. However, I'm not ordering existing construction to be removed at this time. We'll reconvene in 3 weeks for a full evidentiary hearing. It was a partial victory, but construction had already stopped anyway. They were essentially done. The lift just needed final inspections and to be powered on. I left the courthouse frustrated. 3 more weeks of this hanging over me. 3 more weeks of those towers looming over my property. Back home, I found another violation notice from the HOA. This time, my yard waste was an issue. They were citing me for firewood I'd stacked behind my cabin. Firewood that had been there for 5 years. The harassment was escalating over the next 2 weeks. I received daily violation notices for increasingly absurd things. My solar panels were not aesthetically pleasing. My vegetable garden was agricultural use not permitted in residential zones. My satellite dish was visible from common areas. Each violation came with threats of fines and liens. I documented everything and passed it to Robert. They're trying to bury you in paperwork and stress, he said. It's a common intimidation tactic. Ignore it. None of these violations are enforceable since you're not part of the HOA. The sheriff's fraud investigation was moving slowly. Detective Laura Martinez contacted me and said they were building a case but needed more time to interview witnesses and verify documents. Time I didn't have. The full hearing arrived. This time the courtroom was packed. Apparently, half the Alpine Vista community had shown up to support the HOA. I recognized many faces from around town, all of them shooting me hostile looks. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Both sides presented experts. The HOA brought in a property rights attorney who tried to argue about historical easements and implied rights. Robert demolished those arguments with the actual recorded deed and survey. The turning point came when Robert called the county clerk, Sandra, as a witness. She testified that the signature on the owner notification form didn't match any signature on file for me, and that the address listed for notification was incorrect. So, to be clear, Robert said, the notification was never properly sent to Mr. Harris. That's correct, Sandra said. The address listed was for a property 2 miles away. Gregory tried to argue it was an innocent mistake, but Judge Santiago wasn't buying it. Mr. Walsh, your client submitted documents to this court and to the county claiming they'd properly notified all affected property owners. That notification was either negligently or deliberately falsified. Either way, it's a serious problem. She took a recess to review everything. When she returned, her expression was stern. I've reviewed all evidence presented today. The property surveys are clear. Mr. Harris owns the land in question, including airspace rights, and no valid easement exists for the ski lift. The HOA proceeded with construction without proper notification or permission from the actual property owner. The lift crosses Mr. Harris's property without legal authority. Patricia's face went white. Several of her supporters gasped. Therefore, Judge Santiago continued, I'm issuing a permanent injunction against the operation of the ski lift as currently configured. The Alpine Vista HOA has 90 days to either negotiate a legitimate easement agreement with Mr. Harris or to modify the lift to avoid his property entirely. Additionally, I'm referring the matter of the falsified documents to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential fraud charges. The courtroom erupted. Patricia was shouting something about appeals. David was on his phone, probably calling their lawyers. I just sat there, letting the victory wash over me. Outside, Robert shook my hand. You won, Ethan. Congratulations. What happens now? They'll probably appeal, but they won't win. The evidence is too clear. My guess is they'll try to negotiate with you or modify the lift route. Either way, it doesn't operate without your permission. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The lift towers still loomed over my property, but they were useless without the power to run. That night, Patricia called me. Her voice had lost all its artificial sweetness. Mr. Harris, you've made your point. Name your price for the easement. I told you before, I don't want your money. Reroute the lift. That would cost millions and take months. The ski season will be over. Our investors will sue us. Please be reasonable. I was reasonable. I asked you to stop construction when it started. You ignored me and forged documents. That's on you, Patricia. We're prepared to offer you $250,000. That's more than fair. Not interested. $500,000. That's my final offer. Goodbye, Patricia. I hung up. The next morning, I woke to find my mailbox had been ripped from its post and smashed. My solar panels had been spray painted with black paint. Someone had slashed 3 of my truck's tires. I called the sheriff immediately. Officer Brooks came out to document everything. This looks like retaliation, Mr. Harris. Have you had any threats? just from the HOA president, basically saying I'd regret not being their friend. I'll add this to the ongoing investigation. We're taking the fraud case seriously, by the way. Detective Martinez has found evidence that the HOA president personally signed off on those false documents. Over the next week, the vandalism continued. My fence was damaged. My trash cans were dumped. Someone even tried to break into my cabin while I was in town, though my security system scared them off. The HOA filed their appeal, but their lawyers privately told them it was hopeless. Meanwhile, their grand opening date for the ski lift was approaching. They'd planned a huge event, invited press, promised investors that Alpine Vista would be the premier destination resort in Summit County. Patricia called again. This time she was crying. "Please, Mr. Harris, you're destroying everything we've built. This community needs this lift." 700,000. That's everything we have left in reserves. Then you should have gotten permission first. No deal. You're a cruel man. I'm a man who owns his property and expects his rights to be respected, something you should have thought about before you committed fraud. She hung up on me. The vandalism stopped abruptly. I later learned that Officer Brooks had visited Patricia and informed her that they had security footage from a neighbor's camera showing HOA board member David Brennan spray painting my solar panels. David was arrested and charged with criminal mischief. Apparently, Patricia had ordered him to stand down before he could be connected to the other incidents. The Alpine Vista HOA's grand opening day arrived. It was a Saturday in mid-March, peak ski season, beautiful weather. They'd invited local media, potential investors, and dozens of resort guests. They'd planned champagne, ribbon cutting, the whole show. I'd spent the previous evening considering my options. The judge had granted the injunction, which meant they legally couldn't operate the lift. But I knew Patricia. She was desperate and arrogant. I had a feeling she might try to run it anyway, hoping to present me with a fait accompli and pressure me to accept payment after the fact. So I'd done some research. The lift's power supply came from a main line that crossed the corner of my property before reaching the HOA's facilities. The power company had an old easement for that line, but the significantly increased load from the ski lift hadn't been part of that agreement. I'd quietly contacted the power company and informed them that I was revoking permission for any increased electrical load across my easement. They'd sent me paperwork to sign, which I did. As of Friday evening, the power company had sent Alpine Vista HOA notice that their lift's power supply was temporarily disconnected pending resolution of easement issues. But I had a suspicion Patricia would find a way around that. Sure enough, early Saturday morning, I heard the distinctive hum of large generators starting up. I hiked up to where I could see the resort facilities. They'd brought in temporary generators and were preparing to run the lift anyway. This was getting interesting. I called Robert. "They're violating the injunction. They're about to operate the lift. I'm calling the judge's clerk right now, and the sheriff. Don't do anything rash, Ethan." But I was done playing passive victim. I'd spent weeks being harassed, vandalized, and threatened. I'd followed every legal channel. Now they were openly defying a court order. I watched as the grand opening began. There was a stage set up near the base of the lift. Patricia stood at a podium, giving a speech about community vision and mountain paradise. Behind her, the lift's cables were starting to move, carrying empty gondolas in a test run. Within an hour, they were loading guests. Wealthy tourists in expensive ski gear, chattering excitedly as they boarded the gondolas. The lift carried them up, swinging high over the mountain. Right over my property. I waited until there were about 20 gondolas in the air, maybe 160 people total, spread across the lift line. Then I put on my work gloves and hiked to where the generator power lines entered the lift's control building. The building was locked, but the external power connection wasn't. It was a basic industrial setup, and I knew exactly what I was doing. I'd worked construction for years before buying this place. I opened the weatherproof disconnect box and pulled the main breaker. The lift stopped immediately. From my vantage point, I could see the gondolas swaying in the breeze, now motionless. Some were directly over my property, others were scattered along the line. The tallest point was about 60 feet in the air. Not dangerous, but certainly not comfortable. And with the breeze picking up, those gondolas would start swinging. My phone rang. It was Patricia, and she was screaming. "What did you do? Turn the power back on right now. You're operating in violation of a court injunction. The lift is shut down until you comply with the law. There are people up there. Guests. This is criminal." "No, what's criminal is you defying a judge's order. Call the fire department if you need to evacuate them. I'm sure they have equipment for that." "You're insane. I'm calling the police." "Please do. I'll wait right here for them." I sat on a rock near the disconnect and watched the chaos unfold below. Resort staff were running around in panic. Guests at the base were demanding refunds. The people in the gondolas were calling down, some angry, some scared. A few of the gondolas were swaying pretty significantly in the wind. Sheriff's vehicles arrived within 20 minutes. Officer Brooks and Detective Martinez both showed up along with the fire department. I waved to them from my spot. "Mr. Harris," Detective Martinez called up, "we need you to restore power so we can evacuate the guests." "Not happening. They're in violation of a court order. The power stays off until they shut down the operation entirely and comply with Judge Santiago's injunction." Patricia was down there too, screaming at the officers. "Arrest him. He's endangering people." Officer Brooks hiked up to where I was sitting. "Ethan, I understand you're angry, but we have people stuck up there. Some of them are getting scared. There's a kid in one of those gondolas crying his eyes out." Then Patricia should have thought about that before she violated a court order. The lift isn't going back on. The fire department can evacuate them. That'll take hours. Please. I considered. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted these people to face consequences for once. "I'll make you a deal." Patricia publicly admits she violated the injunction and agrees in writing to dismantle the lift. "Then I'll restore power long enough to evacuate everyone." Brooks radioed down to Detective Martinez. I could see them talking to Patricia. She was shaking her head violently. The standoff continued. An hour passed. The temperature was dropping. Some of the guests were clearly cold, though the gondolas were enclosed. The fire department had set up their rescue equipment, but acknowledged it would take 3 to 4 hours to safely evacuate everyone using their ladder trucks and rope systems. A news helicopter appeared overhead. This was going to be all over Colorado news. Alpine Vista HOA's grand opening was a complete disaster, broadcast live. My phone rang again. This time it was Robert. "Ethan, what the hell are you doing?" Enforcing the injunction that everyone else seems willing to ignore. "You can't take the law into your own hands. You're going to end up arrested." "They're the ones who violated the court order, not me. I'm just exercising my property rights. That power line crosses my land, and I have the right to control what crosses my land. We established that in court." Robert was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a solid legal argument, but you're making enemies of everyone up there." "They were already my enemies. At least now they're taking me seriously." Another hour passed. More news helicopters. The story was trending on social media. Alpine Vista, HOA's grand opening disaster. Guests stranded on ski lift. One enterprising reporter had already dug up the court case details and was reporting on the property rights dispute. Patricia finally cracked. She hiked up with Detective Martinez and Officer Brooks. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared from crying. "Fine, you win. I'll sign whatever you want. Just turn the power back on." I want it in writing, witnessed by Detective Martinez. "You admit you violated the court injunction. You agreed to dismantle the lift within 30 days. And you personally apologize for the harassment, vandalism, and fraud. You're a vindictive bastard. I'm a property owner who's been pushed too far. Sign or your guests spend the night up there. It's supposed to drop into the 20s tonight. Those gondolas aren't heated." Detective Martinez handed Patricia a notepad. "Write what he said, Miss Monroe. This is the fastest way to resolve this." Patricia wrote with shaking hands. She signed it, dated it. Detective Martinez witnessed it and handed it to me. I read it carefully, then nodded. "Thank you. I'll restore power now, but only long enough to evacuate everyone. Then it goes back off." I flipped the breaker. The lift hummed to life. Down below, the operators started slowly bringing the gondolas down, unloading terrified and angry guests. It took 45 minutes to evacuate everyone safely. Once the last guest was down, I threw the breaker again. The lift fell silent. "There," I said. "All done." Patricia looked at me with pure hatred. "You've made an enemy of this entire community. I hope you realize that. Your community doesn't respect property rights or court orders. I hope you realize that." Detective Martinez stepped between us. "Miss Monroe, I need you to come down to the station. We have questions about the falsified documents and the violation of the court injunction." "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet, but that depends on your cooperation." I watched them walk down the mountain. Officer Brooks stayed with me. "That was pretty extreme, Ethan." "Was it?" "They committed fraud, violated a court order, endangered people by operating equipment illegally, and thought they could get away with it because they're rich. Someone had to hold them accountable. Still, you could have handled it differently." I tried. For weeks, I tried the right way. Sometimes the right way doesn't work. The news coverage was intense. By evening, the story was national. Social media was divided. Some people called me a hero for standing up to an abusive HOA. Others called me a monster for stranding innocent people. I didn't care much either way. I was just tired. The district attorney's office contacted me 2 days later. They were charging Patricia Monroe and David Brennan with fraud related to the falsified documents. Susan Clark had cooperated with investigators and received immunity. She testified that Patricia had orchestrated the whole thing, pressuring the HOA's legal team to find any way to build the lift, even if it meant cutting corners on property rights. The criminal trial moved surprisingly quickly. Patricia's lawyers tried to get the charges dismissed, but the evidence was overwhelming. In June, she pleaded guilty to fraud and filing false documents. She received 2 years probation, a hefty fine, and was permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in Colorado. David Brennan pleaded guilty to the vandalism charges and received community service and restitution. The civil side took longer. The HOA filed for bankruptcy protection, claiming the failed lift project had bankrupted them. Their insurance company fought them, arguing that fraud wasn't covered. It was a mess. Meanwhile, the lift towers stood over my property like skeletal reminders. The HOA couldn't afford to dismantle them, and I wasn't about to pay for it myself. In August, I was contacted by a different resort company, Keystone Ventures, that owned properties throughout Summit County. They'd heard about the situation and had a proposal. They wanted to buy out Alpine Vista's assets, including the lift, and do things properly. "We'll reroute the lift," their representative, A straightforward man named James Porter told me. It'll cost us about $2 million to modify, but it's better than having a useless lift sitting there. We'd also like to offer you a 10-year contract for a small easement across the corner of your property for power and utility lines, properly documented and compensated. $50,000 up front and $10,000 per year. Why should I trust you when the last group lied to my face? James pulled out a thick folder. Because we've already done all the due diligence. Here are the property surveys, the legal reviews, the engineering studies. We're not asking you to sign anything today. Take it to your lawyer. Have him review everything. We'll do this right or not at all. I took the documents to Robert. He spent 2 weeks reviewing everything with a fine-tooth comb. It's legitimate, Ethan. They're actually doing this properly. The easement is narrow and specific. The compensation is fair, and they have the money to actually reroute the lift. I signed the agreement in September. Keystone Ventures took over Alpine Vista's assets through the bankruptcy proceedings. They immediately began dismantling the towers on my property and building new routes that avoided my land entirely. The new lift design actually worked better, creating a more scenic route. The remaining Alpine Vista HOA board resigned. The community voted to dissolve the HOA entirely and form a new one with strict oversight rules and term limits for board members. They invited me to join as a non-voting advisory member. I declined politely. Patricia Monroe moved away from Breckenridge. I heard she relocated to Arizona. David Brennan kept his head down and rarely left his condo. Susan Clark actually apologized to me one day when I ran into her at the grocery store. I should have stood up to Patricia earlier, she said. I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I went along with it. I'm sorry. Thank you for testifying, I said. That took courage. The new lift opened the following December, properly routed, properly permitted. I even rode it once just to see what all the fuss had been about. The view was nice. I understood why they'd wanted it. But I was glad to be back on my property, my 15 acres of peace and quiet. Well, relatively quiet. The resort was still there and tourists still came, but they stayed on their side of the property line and I stayed on mine. On a cold January evening, almost a year after the whole mess started, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set over the mountains. The ski lift glided smoothly along its new route, far from my property. The towers I'd stared at for months were gone, leaving only some patches of disturbed earth that would green up come spring. My phone rang. It was Robert. Hey, Ethan. Just wanted to let you know the bankruptcy court approved the final settlement. You're officially in the clear. No more liens, no more claims. It's over. Thanks, Robert, for everything. Thank you. It's not often I get to work on a case that's so clearly right versus wrong. You stood your ground and you won. Not many people would have had the guts. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about the whole ordeal. Had I handled it perfectly? Probably not. Stranding those people had been extreme, and I still felt a twinge of guilt about the kid who'd been crying in the gondola. But sometimes, when you're dealing with people who think money and influence put them above the law, you have to make a statement loud enough that they can't ignore it. The legal system had worked eventually. The fraud charges stuck. The property rights were upheld. The bad actors faced consequences. But it had taken me refusing to be pushed around, documenting everything, and yes, making a dramatic stand to get there. I'd learned a lot about HOAs in the past year. They can be necessary for maintaining communities, but they can also be tools of petty tyranny when the wrong people get control. Power attracts people who want to wield it, and HOA boards attract people who enjoy telling others what to do. The key was accountability. The old Alpine Vista HOA had none. Patricia and her cronies did whatever they wanted, sure that their money and lawyers would smooth over any problems. The new HOA had strict rules, regular audits, and term limits. It would probably work much better. As for me, I was done with all of it. I had my property, my peace, and my rights intact. The check from Keystone Ventures had cleared, giving me a nice financial cushion. Life was good. A few weeks later, I was in town at the hardware store when I ran into James Porter from Keystone Ventures. He shook my hand warmly. "Ethan, the lift's performing great. Ridership is up 30% over projections. You did us a favor, honestly. The new route is better in every way. Glad it worked out. Listen, I wanted to thank you properly. We're having a small dinner for key partners next month. Would you join us? Just a nice meal, no business talk. We'd like to show our appreciation." I almost declined automatically, but then I thought about it. These were people who treated me with respect, who'd done things the right way. Maybe it was time to stop being so isolated. "Sure, James, I'd like that." The dinner was at a nice restaurant in Breckenridge. I met the other partners and investors, normal people who were genuinely interested in building a good business rather than stroking their egos. We talked about skiing, mountain living, and the challenges of development in environmentally sensitive areas. Nobody mentioned the standoff or the stranded guests. It was refreshing. On the drive home, I realized I was actually smiling. For the first time in a year, I felt truly settled. The fight was over. I'd won. More importantly, I'd proven that individuals still had rights, even against organized groups with more money and power. Spring came to the mountains. The snow melted, revealing the patches where the old lift towers had stood. I planted native grasses and wildflowers there. By summer, you could barely tell anything had been disturbed. I was working in my garden one morning when a car pulled up. A young couple got out, looking nervous. "Mr. Harris, I'm Tommy Chen and this is my wife Amy. We're Robert Chen's son and daughter-in-law. He told us about your case. We're thinking of buying property near an HOA in Frisco, and we wanted to ask your advice." I invited them in for coffee and spent an hour telling them everything I'd learned. Read every document. Hire a good lawyer before you sign anything. Understand exactly what you're getting into, and never ever assume an HOA will act in good faith. Get everything in writing. They thanked me profusely. As they left, Amy turned back. "You know, you're kind of a legend in property rights circles now. There are forums online where people share your story as an example of how to fight back against HOA overreach." Really? I was just protecting my land. That's what makes it powerful. You weren't trying to be a hero. You were just standing up for what was right. After they left, I looked up some of those forums. Sure enough, my story was everywhere. Colorado man shuts down illegal ski lift. Property owner strands HOA guests after fraud discovery. How to fight back against HOA abuse. Most of the comments were supportive. People shared their own HOA horror stories. Some criticized my methods, but even they acknowledged that the HOA had been completely in the wrong. I closed my laptop and went back outside. Fame, even minor internet fame, wasn't for me. I'd done what I had to do and it was over. That was enough. Summer turned to fall, and the aspens painted the mountains gold. I spent my days hiking, maintaining my property, and enjoying the solitude I'd fought so hard to preserve. The new Alpine Vista HOA sent me a holiday card in December, thanking me for my patience during their transition and wishing me well. It was a nice gesture. As another winter settled over the mountains, I sat in my cabin watching the snow fall, grateful for the warmth of the fire and the peace of my surroundings. The ski lift hummed in the distance, carrying happy tourists to the slopes, far from my property line. I'd learned that standing up for yourself often comes with a cost. Legal fees, stress, conflict, and yes, being the subject of controversy. But I'd also learned that some things are worth fighting for. Property rights matter. Personal freedom matters. The rule of law matters. Patricia Monroe and her cronies had thought they could steamroll over me because I was just one person against their organized, wealthy community. They'd learned otherwise. Sometimes, one person standing firm is enough. I never did join the new HOA, even as an advisory member. I didn't need to. They'd learned their lesson about respecting boundaries, both legal and physical. We coexisted peacefully, neighbors who kept to our own sides of the fence, and every time I looked up at that ski lift, following its proper route around my property, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served. The system had worked, and my 15 acres remained mine, undisturbed and peaceful just as they should be. The story could have ended there, but life doesn't always package itself neatly. In early February, almost exactly 2 years after the whole mess began, I received a letter from the Colorado Attorney General's office. They were conducting a broader investigation into HOA fraud across the state, and my case had served as a catalyst. They wanted me to testify before a state legislative committee considering HOA reform laws. I drove to Denver on a cold February morning. The State House was imposing, all marble and authority. I was nervous. Public speaking had never been my thing. But when I sat at the witness table and looked at the legislators, I thought about all the people I'd heard from online who'd been abused by their HOAs with no recourse. Mr. Harris, the committee chair, a senator named Ellen Roberts, began, "Thank you for coming today. Can you describe in your own words what happened with Alpine Vista HOA?" I told the story simply and clearly. The forged documents, the illegal construction, the harassment, the vandalism, the defiance of a court order, and finally, my decision to shut down the lift. "Some would say your actions were extreme," Senator Roberts said. "How do you respond to that?" I followed the law. I went to court. I got an injunction. They violated it. At that point, what choice did I have? Let them operate illegally because they were wealthy and connected. Someone had to enforce the injunction, and the authorities weren't doing it fast enough. Another legislator, Representative Mark Thompson, leaned forward. "But you endangered people. There were children on that lift." The HOA endangered people by operating equipment in violation of a court order over property they didn't own. I shut it down safely. Nobody was hurt. The fire department was there within minutes. If Patricia Monroe had cared about those children's safety, she wouldn't have started the lift in the first place. The questioning continued for an hour. Some legislators were sympathetic, others skeptical. But I told the truth and let them make of it what they would. The committee ultimately recommended new legislation requiring independent oversight of HOAs, stronger penalties for fraud, and clearer property rights protections. The bill passed 6 months later. It became known informally as the Alpine Vista Law, though officially it had some longer, boring title. I received a framed copy of the bill from Senator Roberts with a note. "Thank you for your courage. This will help protect thousands of Colorado homeowners." I hung it in my cabin, next to my property deed. Both documents represented the same thing: rights that matter and the willingness to defend them. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I turned 50 that spring and threw myself a quiet party. Robert Chen came up, along with a few other friends I'd made over the years. We grilled steaks, drank good whiskey, and told stories under the stars. "You know what I learned from all this?" I said, somewhat tipsy. "It's not about being brave or heroic. It's about knowing what you value and refusing to compromise on it. I valued my property and my peace. That's what I fought for, nothing more complicated than that. Robert raised his glass. To simple values and the complex fights they sometimes require. We drank to that. Years passed. The story faded from public consciousness, though it still lived on in property rights forums and HOA reform discussions. I aged quietly in my mountain cabin, watching seasons turn, occasionally hosting visitors, but mostly enjoying the solitude I'd always wanted. The ski lift continued operating successfully. Keystone Ventures expanded their resort, always properly permitted, always respecting boundaries. They sent me a Christmas card every year. I appreciated the gesture. I never saw Patricia Monroe again. I heard through the grapevine that she'd gotten involved in a condo association in Scottsdale and had been promptly voted off the board when residents looked up her history. Some people never learn. David Brennan actually reached out to me about 5 years after the incident. He sent a letter apologizing sincerely for his role in everything. "I let Patricia manipulate me," he wrote. "I thought we were doing something good for the community and I didn't ask enough questions. The vandalism was inexcusable. I'm sorry." I wrote back, accepting his apology. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption. On the 10th anniversary of the ski lift incident, a local journalist contacted me asking to do a retrospective story. I almost declined, but then I thought about all the people who'd reached out over the years sharing their own HOA struggles. Maybe one more telling of the story would help someone. The journalist, a young woman named Rachel Kim, came to my cabin. We sat on the porch, now weathered but still solid, and talked for hours. "What do you want people to understand about what happened?" she asked. I thought about that. "I want them to understand that the law exists to protect everyone, not just the wealthy and connected. And sometimes, enforcing those protections requires uncomfortable action. I didn't shut down that lift to be vindictive. I did it because every other mechanism had failed. The HOA had ignored my complaints, forged documents, defied a court order, and thought they could get away with it because I was just one guy against their organization. Do you regret anything about how you handled it? I regret that it got to that point. I wish Patricia and her board had simply followed the law from the beginning. But no, I don't regret shutting down the lift. It was the right thing to do. The article ran in the Summit Daily News and got picked up by several national outlets. Once again, briefly, I was internet famous. Once again, I ignored it and went about my life. Now, as I write this, I'm 60 years old. I still live in my cabin on my 15 acres. The property is mine, free and clear, just as it always should have been. The mountains are still beautiful. The elk still visit. And the ski lift glides smoothly along its proper route, a constant reminder of the importance of respecting boundaries. People sometimes ask me if I'd do it all again, knowing the stress and conflict it would cause. I always answer the same way. I'd do whatever was necessary to protect my rights and my property. That's not about being aggressive or confrontational. It's about understanding that some things are worth fighting for, and that backing down in the face of illegal abuse only encourages more abuse. The Alpine Vista incident taught me that individuals still have power in this country, even against organized groups with more money. But that power only works if you're willing to use it, willing to endure criticism and conflict, and willing to stand firm on principle. It also taught me about the importance of community, the real kind built on respect and mutual boundaries, rather than the forced kind created by HOA bylaws. My neighbors and I get along fine now because we respect each other's property and rights. That's how it should always have been. As the sun sets over the Rockies, painting the peaks gold and pink, I sit on my porch with a cup of coffee and feel grateful. grateful for this place, for the life I've built, and for the reminder that sometimes one person standing firm really can make a difference. The ski lift cables catch the evening light, glinting like threads of gold across the mountain. They're beautiful in their way as long as they stay where they belong, and they do. They always will, because I made sure of it.